Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into our After Dinner Mint series titled Behind the Code. On the show, we welcome Art Blocks artists to share a deeper look into their project's creative coding and process. Today, we welcome Cole Sternberg, who joins us to speak about his project, The Spring Begins with the First Rainstorm, along with Radix, Dixon. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, thanks.
Hello.
Awesome to have you. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, let me
Great.
screen share here. I think that's working.
Here it comes.
Sorry, one second. Oh, here we go. Start at the beginning too. Okay, well, this is my project. The spring begins with the first rainstorm. I thought at first I'd just like give a conceptual overview to how we came about this idea and this concept and this visual. 6 or 7 years ago, I traveled on the maiden voyage of a shipping vessel across the Pacific and made a physical painting studio on the ship and had no preconceived notion of what I was going to make. But about a weekend, I had finished some paintings and I got brave enough to throw one in the water, and it created the patterning that you see here in this work. You'll notice the human hand is pretty much gone. The movement feels like light fracturing through water or fracturing through trees in a forest. And I love the idea that the composer became the environment. So with this project, I wanted to mirror that concept of losing the human hand, which seemed apropos for this style of generative work anyways. And the thought was basically to use two otherworldly beings to make the thing, one being the earth still, like the painting, and the other being the computer and the code. So we wanted to accomplish something kind of similar to this painting. There's a little video on here that just gives you a kind of 1 minute dramatic idea of how this all started. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of where it all came from. And I mean, it ends with the bird who had been eaten partially by another bird, because that kind of feels like what we're doing as humans in the environment and sort of just slowly cannibalizing ourselves. Today, I was telling these guys it's 111 degrees here. Never experienced that level of heat. And it, I don't know, it all scarily fits in with this project. To give a little background why Rob is here. Well, Rob and I are friends, and we talked about this project for a long time. He is a master coder, whereas I'm a novice coder, and I worked on building the structure to a degree on my own, and he came in to collaborate and help make it much better and more effective and rich in terms of how each of the layers are made and how they interact seamlessly, especially, on being all solely on chain. It needed a little bit of fine tuning, but then the fine tuning became a real collaboration, and you'll see creatively we work together to really form this whole thing, starting with defining these 4 key actions or layers, composing the underlying color washes, adding wind effects, applying the patterning, which you'll see what that is in a second, and adding portals. For me, like I said, that movement was the most important thing. I wanted to maintain this one physical earthly component, and the colors and all those other things didn't need to be maintained in the same way. So you can see here in these black and white images, it's just that movement. Sometimes it feels like the light, sometimes it feels like water, sometimes it feels like tree bark or a reptile skin. It's really amazing once you leave these things to the earth, whether it's dragging it behind a huge boat or left in the wind. The earth really does start becoming the artist of them. So that sent us into the actual, making of the code. I guess I'll let maybe Rob, if you want to talk through these patterning slides, that might be cool.
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, those patterns are so rich and detailed. And the challenge was, how are we going to recreate those or apply those in something like an art blocks project where, code size should be small and everything's on chain. So in general, it's very hard to have, big high-res detailed images in a project like that. So we looked at a lot of different ways. We didn't want to lose a lot of that detail, because the detail is what makes these things so interesting. The way the environments change these images. So we did a lot of work on different compression ideas, different ways of, turning these patterns into something that we could recreate, enlarge, add back some detail, things like that. So the slide here is showing one of the techniques we use, and here's a great example of how we had to compress them. So we had the very large images with lots of detail. We ended up compressing them down to about 288 by 346 pixels. And we also found that even at that size, it's a lot to put in source code. But we found that after trying smaller images, larger images, and found a balance there where we ended up with 11 of these compressed down to that size. And then we had to do a lot of different things to make those work and make it interesting with only 11. So yeah, the default way to encode these, we had to encode them, take these binary files and encode them into source code, something that can be stored in source code. And kind of a web standard way of doing that is something called base64, which basically takes a 64 character set and treats it like a base64 number. And so you encode these down. It's normally used to kind of transport things across the internet, to send binary data as text wherever you need to do that. And it's not necessarily a great compression algorithm. Depending on the image itself, like how much detail there is, the more detail, the bigger it gets. And sometimes the base64 can actually be bigger than the original binary image. But we tried other things. We tried a lot of different compression algorithms. We knew we were going to use these images. We had tried to create some with things like GLSL or just P5 algorithms, and we were not getting the same richness that Cole had in his images that the environment had contributed to. So we did try other compression schemes for the images, since we knew we were going to have to use the binaries. We wrote some of our own. I used some kind of game development techniques to pack binary data. And in the end, we could never get more than about a 10% improvement in file size. And so kind of decided at that point that a custom algorithm, we're going to have all that custom algorithm code in there. So that's going to increase things a little bit. Plus, we'll have to maintain that back and forth. So in the end, we just went with base64, even though it did cost us maybe 10% on file size. It was just the easier way to manage it. And this is what the base64 encoding looks like. So 11 images, even at this tiny size, 288 by 346 pixels, 11 images came out to 464K of code just for the images alone. And that's what it looks like. So there's a lot of that if you ever look at the script for this project. So it was pretty huge. And in the end, we might have been one of the largest art blocks projects, if not the largest art blocks project in terms of code size. Not necessarily something to be proud of, but still great in that we were able to get all this binary data in there and use it in the way we intended. 43 uploads, 477K total. The images were 464 of that, and the code itself was only 13K, which, so I can be proud enough of the, that's fairly efficient for an art blocks project if it was just that. Cole was incredible. He did all the uploads. He got them all in there. I mean, that was a stressful day, wasn't it, Cole?
Yeah, I mean, just to get them all in. I mean, especially the mess that is the base 64 portion of it, because it's not like code you can read and notice things. It just looks like a mess when it's done. I mean, minified regular code looks much better than this stuff. So yeah, right. it was pretty wild. But I mean, for me, frankly, there's a way to draw structures that have that kind of movement in the code, but it was important for me to keep something that the earth made itself. So I didn't want to. I wanted that earthly presence to still have a footprint on this, and that's why we went through all of this sort of tricky stuff and difficult, stressful, expensive stuff to keep that there, because it just seemed more real in a way.
Right. And I agree. The few attempts we made at doing something computer generated to mimic that didn't mimic it, and it didn't have the same feel. So yeah, in the end, we ended up with those 11 images, 16 grayscale colors, and all encoded in base 64.
And that sent us down the path of all of these options. Right. Rob, we'll get back to you in a second, but I just enjoyed. So once you have those patterns, you have a color palette that we'll get to too, but the pattern itself can act as a color palette. And for me and the theme and the concept of this, I thought, well, it's nice to have something that's sort of like the dark of late at night, something that's sort of like the winter coming, and something that feels more like a floral arrangement or spring itself. They kind of, it's not the four seasons, but it's in that sort of vein of visuals of the environment. And it allowed us, as one step of it to give it this extra special sort of patterning layer.
Right. Yeah. And we had gone through what we did, like 8 or 9 blend modes, I think, before we settled on those 3. Like different ways of applying the pattern to the background colors and having them interact. And, think of Photoshop filters when you think of blend modes. And P5 recreates a number of those kind of filters. It has some bugs, as we found out later, like it doesn't do it the same on all platforms for those blend modes. But in the end, and I know I think it was you, Cole, that you had this vision, this is the great thing about this collab, is you really had a great idea from the start of what this should all look like and what the feel should be. So when it came down to narrowing down the blend modes and all that, it was just like, these are the ones. And it made sense. These were the 3 that really worked.
Dithering. I'll let Rob talk about it, but it's probably the funniest word in the whole presentation.
Yeah, that's right. We're dithering. But yeah, so we did a lot of stuff. We only had the 11 images to work with. So we played a lot of tricks to make them interesting, because, we wanted to do 400, 500 in the series. And so we needed to have 11 base images that would then get manipulated in different ways. We had to do interesting things to them. So first, they were very small to start with, and they're being magnified, 4x to get to the standard size. Actually, more than that, more like 6x, I guess, and even bigger for some of the slanted ones. So we had to do something to make things crisper looking once they were magnified. We also did tricks like cut two of them in half and splice them together, mirror the left half of one onto the right half to get a mirroring effect. Plenty of things like that. And then, of course, the inverting. They can go white on black to black on white. And, of course, the checkerboards from that. So the dithering came at the end of all that. And one reason for the dithering was when we're taking a small image and enlarging it so big, it would tend to be a little muddled. But the dithering gave us a very nice pattern texture to it and made things look a lot more crisp. So it took those things, made them more crisp, but also after we did all the splicing and mirroring, we could apply the dithering effect. And it also gave a feeling, extra texture, a feeling like fabric or canvas to the whole image. So it was applied after everything else. We tried different algorithms. We tried the Floyd Steinberg, which is a very interesting one, but just wasn't the right feel. Atkinson, which is the dithering one that was used for the old Apple Macintosh black and white stuff. Also looked cool, but not the effect we were after. And so in the end, it was basic Bayer dithering, which is one of the simplest algorithms that gave us the best effect, that kind of canvas feel to the whole thing. So here's some of the other things we were doing with the thing. So we would mirror some of them to get that. So those are the ones, they're generally straight up and down. You'll see they're true north or true south, as we say. And so the one on the left was mint zero, as I recall.
Yep.
Which, the mirrored ones have a very interesting look, and they're the ones you can, often see things in. Like you can see a monster in there, or a fountain, or this kind of stuff. We also rotated them a lot, so to give a different look. So like this one here, the Valley Dreams one in the center, you'll see that a lot top down, the two kind of fan looking shapes top down. But here's one where it got rotated almost 90 degrees to the side. And then the enlarging as well, which goes along with the rotating. When you rotate, we have to enlarge it in order to fill the whole frame.
And all these things are things I really enjoyed, because you can't do this with the physical paintings. Like you can't, once I expose them to the elements, it's up to the elements. So to work on the composition in this way was really exciting. I mean, same with the color palettes that we'll get to, or this mirroring, which is another key part. The mirroring ones just look so cool to us. And you'll see these look very similar, but there are these subtle differences. And I mean, for me, it seems like there's two eyes in the first one eye in the second one, and no eyes in the third one. Just as one example of how, if you just mirror left to right versus right to left versus a full pattern, how you could really like create this rich environment of outputs that was, I mean, we thought it was pretty rad.
Right. Yep. And you'll see these in there, every one can be mirrored, right to left or left to right, and then also turned upside down. We ended up not mirroring top to bottom. We tried that and they looked a little weird. The patterns just weren't built that way, but left to right worked great.
Which is really strange, because I don't know rationally why it wouldn't work. Like it seems like it would have worked, but it didn't. We would look at them and think, oh, that doesn't.
Yeah, it looked a little artificial. I mean, this does a little bit sometimes, but like this center one, if you took that top part and mirrored it to the bottom, then the lines were just meeting so evenly right in the middle that it looked fake. To me, anyway.
To me too.
Inverting the colors was the other thing we did. So, and that led to, because there's a search for variety in an Art Blocks project, right? We want everything to be different and interesting, each mint to be unique. And again, we just had 10 base patterns or 11 base patterns to start from. So the first was the splitting two and splicing them together, which you see on the far left here. And that made some really interesting combinations. I have had some people say, oh, the line down the middle looks fake or something. But You know, it's also talking about a dichotomy. It's like two facets of something coming together there. And so I still think those are super interesting. The checkerboard, the quads through the checkerboards were another thing. You know, Cole, I know you did some like concept stuff with this and showed it to me. I'm like, well, that was really cool looking stuff. You know, we would invert part of an image and not the other parts. So it changes in one square from black on white to white on black, basically the pattern, and then gets applied to the same color background. And at first I thought, well, you know, this is going to get complicated. But in fact, the code for this turned out to be super simple because I had been learning some GLSL at the same time. And if anyone knows the GLSL shader language, pixel by pixel kind of manipulations of simple geometric stuff are the bread and butter in that. So this actually turned out to be one of the easiest things to implement in the end.
And it was a tricky thing because you don't want like the black and white barbershop or whatever 50s checkerboard. You still want it to feel environmental and
Right.
interact well. So I mean, from which comes in other parts too, but the richness of the blacks or the inverted whites or the opacity of the original images, you know, or the color patterns and all these things really had to work in a specific way for this repetition to be effective. Like you'll notice the 8x8 one, you know, that color palette is still so seamless and elegant in a way. So it was cool because we weren't really sure we could get it to the point where it worked with the non-checkerboard ones, but we found sort of its place.
And I think they're really interesting too. Like that center one, what I find so interesting about this project overall is that when you look at one image, the structure of what you're seeing comes from these 4 or 5 different layers that are built into this image, and they kind of compete. Like, does a checkerboard thing the main thing you look at, or is it these color washes that go across that and kind of erode the checkerboard pattern away? Or is it the wind lines that you'll see sometimes? Or the colors themselves will sometimes have, you know, borders among them. So the structure of these things can come from any one of those layers, and I find that trade-off really interesting.
Oh, me too. And sometimes you have almost an alien piece, like the second one, the quad, or 2x2, however you want to call it. Like the top left, you know, sort of looks apart from the other components of it. It still works. I mean, it's one of my favorite ments actually, but you know, it wasn't so obvious that it would happen like that.
Right.
Then we get to the full-on application.
Right. So yeah, I can talk about this a little bit. So then the process of actually getting those images in and working with them, and we'll have a little bit of code to look at for this too. So we would load 1 pattern or 2 pattern images. If we were going to do this splicing together, we would need 2. So we can mirror them at that point. We can splice them. We would apply the darkness levels, and that was an early slide. But what that did, since we stored these as grayscale, we could make them darker or lighter and have more detail pop in or less detail, and the whole thing being darker, the whole thing being lighter. And so that was another way of adding variety. Inverting the dark and light, as we just talked about, we could either invert the whole image, so it's, you know, basically going to pull white or fade the white away from the colors, or it can be dark, where it's going to apply the dark pattern on top, or do that in the squares. The rotating and scaling, some aren't rotated. Those are the ones that, you know, the compass is basically telling you, the compass feature, that whether they're true north or south, they're just not rotated or just rotated a full 180. And we would have to then scale them to fit the frame, or else the corners would be blank, and that was no good. And then applying the blend modes, as we talked about, kind of like Photoshop filters at the end, which are talking about how the applied pattern is going to interact with the background colors and the rest. And we'll have some visual examples of this coming up too. So we're just going to do a little bit of code here. This is when we're loading the image in the first place. So we, in the draw feature, so in P5, the draw runs either as a loop or just one at a time, just once if you have the no loop thing set. So we did set this as no loop, and then we had to load the image. So we had to wait for the image to load if we're loading a new bitmap. We also have to handle the case where it's only resizing. So we do have this very responsive. So if you move your browser window and change the size or something like that while you're looking at one, it will immediately redraw to the right size. And so this covers that. In that case, we don't need to reload the underlying image. We just need to go paint it again at the new size. So here where we're loading the image, basically it's asynchronous, and then this is what's going to happen when it's finally loaded. We're going to resize that bitmap image up to the size that we're looking at now. So taking it from that 286 pixel one up to a bigger size to work with. We track whether we're going to have 2 images or 1. And if we have 1, we're done here and we're just going to keep moving. If we have 2, that's this diptych style. Is 1, that means we're going to have 2 images. So we're going to go and set up the variable, so we're going to load again, and that's where we do the PF loop, meaning, okay, exit out of this draw call and now start back in again. We're going to loop again and come back a second time to get the next image. Then at this point, we could do the splicing, we can do the mirroring, which we have a mirror image call, which will just take one from left to right, right to left. These variables, the mirror vert, mirror first, those were set early on by the hash and the random variables driven by the hash. So we knew based on the hash whether this is going to be a mirrored mint or not. And if so, it's going to be mirrored left to right, right to left, that kind of thing. And that's where those variables came from. Or if it's just a basic one, we just, if it's a basic one, we just apply that. And then we do the dithering. So the dithering is done after all of the image chopping. Because otherwise you would, be chopping things together that might be dithered differently, and that would be no good. Okay. And so then we do the inversion stuff if we're going to do it. So again, this is set, whether or not to do this is set by the hash. And so we either are going to do a white on black or a black on white version, or if it was randomly selected to be a quad, or 4x4, 8x8, 16x16, that's all handled there. And so this is where in P5, you use the load pixels and then update pixels calls to basically say, give me this bitmap image, and now I'm going to process pixel by pixel all the way through this image. And that's how we would handle the image reversal, and then also the checkerboarding based on how many columns or rows we were working there. So that's the code for that. And now we'll get on to colors. We've talked about the patterns, and I'm going to defer to you here, Cole, because you're the color master. I mean, I was so impressed with your work in the project.
I mean, I'm not as helpful in the coding, but I've seen colors for a very long time, and I mean, this is one of the most exciting parts about making generative works and digital works in general, I guess, because you can have so much flexibility with colors. You can change colors, erase colors. So I spent days and days in a kind of old school Excel spreadsheet manner of listing these colors, changing them slightly. I started in RGB and would change just the blue a little bit or just the green, and get to this palette that it kind of looks like the whole rainbow of colors here. It is the whole rainbow, but there's specific volumes, like the blues and the greens are heavier than reds, significantly heavier. Mm-hmm. The reds, oranges, and yellows are all in more pale tones. There's only a few really vibrant colors, which I use because they're exciting and look nice, but in general in painting, my palette tends to be more muted. So I was just sort of going crazy trying to select these. There's 300 in total. Yeah. And luckily it seemed to work together. We pick a maximum of 6 with each thing. And then this, actually the paints in the background of this photo, that's them all laid out on the boat. It's funny that my physical operation is kind of pretty similar to the digital operation.
It's true. And yeah, I was just so impressed because, I've been doing this for a while too. And I had tried early on to do just random color sets and generally found they didn't work well for me. And predefined palettes, I was doing 30, 40 predefined palettes per project in the past. And this just blew my mind because picking 6 out of 300, God, 90%, 99% of the time, we're getting just amazing combinations and they never look bad. So I was just so impressed with that.
Oh, thanks. Like Rob was saying, like, there are two options: randomly selecting colors from that 300 mix, or we specified a few rare palettes, and most of the rare palettes, actually, I don't even think came up, but
Hardly, yeah.
The ones that did come up, I mean, they're all pretty much monochromatic, but I would pick 6 versions of that color: orange, yellow, whatever, blue, that I thought would interact well together. So a couple of the colors would be, very close in tone, and then maybe one would be very dark and one would be very light. And it just kind of felt like how I would paint a watercolor painting, and you apply more water or more pressure, and the like pigment kind of floats away and at different levels. And then, there's always the opportunity to flip the colors, add a gradient, create these other sort of rare occurrences. And when they happen, they work great. I kind of wish they were, I don't know that it would work for 10,000 versions, but I'd like to see more of the rare occurrences happen in reality. Here's a way of looking at it. 95% of the pieces that were minted fell into the "and all the riches of the earth" category. And you'll see that's the one here is the full rainbow of options, and they kind of merge nicely together. And then the more rare ones were these singular colors. And you'll notice all the features have kind of strange names. For me, that's part of the mystery and investigation and game of it. These ones are fairly self-explanatory, but the oranges were Helios, the purples were Regicide, because purple tends to be the color of monarchs, and Reservoir, blue is the color of water. And when I came to Rob, I'd only organized how we were going to operate with the colors in a couple of ways. And this is one of the great things he suggested was, well, let's think about, how we really apportion them. And there's sort of infinite possibilities, I guess, but we narrowed it down to these 14. I just think they're pretty fun when you see them like this. And it gets it's a little more obvious why they're named things in a way. But these are the 14. I don't know. I thought I had favorites at one point, but it really depends on the colors and how they interact together.
It does. Yeah. And this was, there's these 14, and then there's also either the gradient or then the random, which comes out, the random is almost 10%, I think. And a lot of these we found by doing the random approach. So we'd randomly pick these 6 areas, these 6 kind of elliptical areas within the frame, and then blot the colors around in those 6 places. And after a while, we were finding some really spectacular ones of doing them randomly. And so we just said, well, let's save that. Every time that kind of layout comes up, it looks great. So we would save some of these. I think the last 5 or so were just found randomly. And they were some of the most interesting in the end too. And yes, we'll see a little bit more when we see some examples of how this all turns into the color.
Oh yeah, here I'll skip ahead a couple just to see.
Oh right, there we go.
Here's a couple of the examples.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah. So we use these elliptical areas as guidelines, and then we just blast a lot of semi-transparent colored circles in around those areas. kind of fading out at the edges and being more sparse, so that we get these kind of cloudy effects and kind of color washes. The idea being to replicate what Cole does initially in his paintings is, start with a big, okay, this is all going to be blue and green over here. And that's kind of the first step. So we're trying to find different ways of making that, just the color wash part, interesting as a starting point for the whole image. Yeah, so in terms of what we do with those, so we would take the shapes, and I think it's anywhere from 4 to 6 shapes. This is the elliptical shapes. And we would just blast these circles around. So this is one snippet of code that does that. Basically takes the magnitude, the X and Y position, and then the magnitude of each of these circles, and then uses random kind of Gaussian random numbers to say how far away from the center of this are we going to go, how big are these circles going to be, and how many are going to be, blasted around there. The circles are also done one at a time. So in those layouts, there's like usually a bigger one at the very back and then smaller ones in the front. So the bigger one becomes kind of the main wash for the entire piece. And that's what this particular snippet is doing. And then the smaller ones come on top and do, like a cloud of orange here over the sea of blue that was just behind. It worked really well as a way of just kind of gradually transitioning between colors in the piece. And I think it worked. I think in the end, it's about 12,000 ellipses per image that are just used on the coloring side.
The next part was this wind, which is certainly the most subtle part visually in the end. But, I talk about a lot. I use this earthly patterning. And for instance, this photo here is a painting I left in that beautiful live oak for 9.5 months till it fell out. And it created these sort of wind ripples that look a little bit different than the effect you see on the right in physical form, but not dissimilar. The paint would, in essence, be erased wherever the fabric would fold again and again and again. So I thought that would be a nice, like, little bit of richness to add to the whole thing too.
It is, definitely. And sometimes they're super interesting where they're placed, and especially after you see them with the patterns on top. But yeah, here's an example of just, there was the layout, which was kind of this mesas layout, which progressively, I think the green in this one is in the back and then the ones in front. The colors just worked out great in this particular mint. And then you can see the wind ripples, fairly faint on this one, but in the center image. And then with the pattern applied, the pattern is a little dark, but you can still see some of those wind ripples in the background there. Again, just adding, making this less symmetrical and computer looking and more natural looking. So then after we did all the color stuff, first we did all the color stuff. We also got the patterns in and spliced them up or did whatever we're going to do to them there. So now we're going to rotate the pattern in this code. So some are just going to be the zeros. The angle offset is 0. Those are the true north ones. Others, we are going to actually rotate based on a random value that was picked from the hash of 0 to 360 angle. And then we have to scale them up so that they fit. Now, if you just take a rectangle the size of the frame and rotate it and place it there, you're going to have empty corners. So we had to scale up to fill those empty corners, and did a bunch of geometry on this to figure out the equation for it. And in the end, just approximated. So we have I just did some equations and found some constants that worked. So instead of having complicated equations here for that, we just take this, and it generally works. There's just a little bit of play. It's a little larger than it needs to be sometimes. And then, we would just rotate, and then the image there is applying it on top of the canvas, on top of the color that's already been placed.
Going back to the theme of the whole thing, you'll see if you're stuck in a heavy storm in the middle of the Pacific, the big submarine style doors are shut and you just look out of the little portals. I just love portals, like the feeling of that for me personally experiencing, but it could be in a submarine, or it could be sort of looking towards a black hole or another universe. And we thought, oh, wow, this could be a way to give it another layer of richness and another manner of variety, and a sort of mystique. Like, why are these things floating on top? And, we made the conscious decision to leave those, like you can see in these examples, it's the black and white in the most of the cases, because then it felt really like a separate universe. It would stamp on top of it, and sometimes they interacted seamlessly, like the second image, the first of the actual mints, where the lines just go exactly in line with the pattern. Sometimes they're reversed, sometimes they're completely different one put on top. That was pretty exciting to see that come together and work effectively.
Yeah, it really did add a lot of variety to the mints in the end. And we also tried that variant where we rotated them as well, like gave them their own angle. And I think it just wasn't consistent enough. We had a couple really interesting ones, but for the most part, it just seemed a little off. Like, like the picture fell down and got crooked,
Yeah, it had to look clean, because these are chaotic things. So there had to be some sort of maintenance or preservation within that chaos.
Right.
Otherwise, it would just look messy, I guess.
Exactly. You need a little order among the chaos.
Sure. Here's some more progression photos. You'll see the color wash in the wind.
I just love this one. I love the cloud looking thing on the color wash there. So some of these, the color stuff can almost stand alone as a drop, but then it gets so much more interesting with everything else on top. It's great.
Yeah, I love that one too. It's funny that the code can pick that selection of colors and choose to put them that way. It just
right.
Seems like magic, sort of.
Yeah, this is one of the more colorful ones. The wind is fairly significant in this one. You can see the wind lines. And then this is an example of the difference filter, which is the one, that pretty much reverses the colors. Like it'll take the dark parts of the pattern and reverse the background colors out of those dark parts. And that's what gives you this really interesting, greens turn into kind of copper colors and so on. And in something like this one, by the time you get to the final image there, you basically have 8 little mini images going on in that final one, right? There's the 4 quadrants, and then the portal has the 4 pieces going around it. And each one has its own kind of color sense and its own pattern. It's really cool.
And this is probably the best example of where, if not for how the code works and how generative art works, I probably would have never gotten here visually. It's just such a bright palette. I love it, but I don't tend to start that way in physical pieces. So it's just like really fun to be able to do that and think outside of the box without, building a huge painting and getting a boat and dragging it and seeing if it works.
Yep. There you go. Yeah, this one is. I mean, the colors, they blended so well, even though, just the random selection of pretty odd ones you probably wouldn't pick normally.
Yeah.
But it works.
And this is all 487 in tiny little bits, just as a conclusion slide. I think it needs to be dramatically bigger to really appreciate the differences in them. But I still put them all together just for fun. And that's about it. Yeah. I think that's the spring begins with the first rainstorm.
No, that was amazing work, guys.
Yeah, a great project to work on. A lot of fun, and really happy with the results. I think the really fascinating stuff that came out of this project.
Whoa.
I love seeing the apportionments as well. And I feel like I didn't really understand it until you did the side by side, and then you can see how they're built from the base. So that was really great to see.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it makes a lot more sense. It seems easier to build. Like, it was really difficult for us to build this whole thing. But when you look at, like in hindsight with the structure already built, it's like, oh, okay, that's easy enough. But it took a lot of us looking at the random generations and feeling it out. And sometimes, like the one cultivation, I think it's called, it looks really cool, like it's falling into a hole. But with certain colors, you don't experience that at all. So we had to really analyze that and like, okay, well, you're not experiencing exactly what that layout is. Is it still good? Is it still interesting? And for the ones that are there, it was. But even like the predictive nature that we'd created wasn't always exactly what would come.
Right. And sometimes the colors that would fit in there. I mean, that one we kind of figured would be like something growing, right? Cultivation. And a lot of times it did look like that. There were some that were like, oh, it looks like a campfire that's expanding or something. But then there were others, would be like black, white, dark blue, black. And you'd be like, oh, well, that's an interesting thing. That's not a campfire. Well, don't know what happened. Cool. Yeah.
And so that kind of goes into my first question. So it's definitely a feat to reproduce a natural effect by using code. And so as you described, it takes a lot of trial and error and refinement. So my question is, how do you know when to stop refining?
Well, I mean, I forget, a very famous artist said, making good art isn't about making it, it's about knowing when to stop. And the editing is hard. So it was really just testing. I mean, you could look on either of our computers and probably find 10,000 testments. What's enough checkerboards? At first we thought 8x8 or more isn't going to work. It's not, we're going to lose what we're trying to achieve. And then it did work. Certain colors, are not in there. Certain structures of the colors aren't in there. It's just like testing. You just have to keep testing. And then when you're happy with enough and you think it makes sense with the concept, you just have to force yourself to stop, I guess. I mean, it's a subconscious thing when I make physical paintings, like, and there are times where I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have kept going. It's not as good now. I have to like kind of start over. And this is the same. And for me, not coming from a big background in coding, it took, I don't know, 6 months of working on my own with some help from other coders and stuff, or developers, and just to understand how you build layers and how you take those layers down. And some of the things were much more complex visually, and not really code wise, but I had to kind of like get really confused and messy to get back to something clean and correct.
Right.
Not sure
The blend modes is a good example. We tried so many of those, and a lot of them were similar, and some of them just didn't work right. And we went through a lot of that and ended up with just 3 that we really applied. So that was cool. But in terms of your question, I relied on Cole pretty much to know when we've gone too far. I mean, it was very collaborative, and we were both suggesting, I mean, even like just days before the drop, right? Or before the upload. What if we did this? What if we added this feature? What if we did that? And, and I could usually tell right away from your reaction, Cole. You'd either be like, yeah, that's worth trying. Let's check it out. And you're like, no, it's just not the spirit of this piece. Okay, you're right. You're right. It's not. I totally defer to you on that because you are absolutely right. You've thought about this a lot longer than I have in this particular concept,
Yeah, I mean, it's been years and years of making things in this realm of visual that I think helps with this editing now. Because it was, well, not everything, but it was fairly easy to make certain determinations. And because of the format, it's once again like easy. Okay, that filter we're not going to use. Let me generate another 100 and see if I've missed it or feel something different that's negative. And if I did, I think, okay, well, maybe I was wrong. Let's bring it back and, test it some more. And the process of testing was really, easy with Rob's help, of course.
And then so my second question is, Cole, as an artist working across mediums, obviously your physical practice has influenced your digital work. Would you say your digital work has in turn influenced your physical work since this project?
Oh, well, yes, for sure. Although I've been focusing so much on the digital stuff lately. But in the summer, I created a new body of physical paintings, and the color apportionments, became a little bit different, or a lot different in some cases. Like the colorful palette of flipping the colors that we were just talking about, I actually started with those kind of vibrant palettes that I'd never started with before, to see if I could get it to work as effectively as it did in this project. I think that's the most immediate thing. But I've been so into taking more coding lessons and thinking of generative projects that I haven't actually been, making too many of physical paintings at the moment. Oh, and also the pixelization that we ended up with, that I think is a great reference to computers in general. I started using that in some paintings. So I would add a printed layer. So it's kind of the same thing as these. I don't know why I didn't think of the relationship before the second, but it's basically a physical painting, then a digital print that's intentionally pixelated, then more physical painting, then exposed to the elements. So it was really, I mean, because there's a photograph of something realistic, it's, I guess, a little different in the end, but the process is the same as The Spring Begins.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then my final question, I mean, I think it's a little open-ended, but open-ended on purpose, is kind of on the power of like collaboration, right? I feel like throughout the presentation, you were taking turns going back and forth, and two different people from different backgrounds creating something that's, bigger than themselves. So I guess your thoughts on that, and how, I guess, generative art and NFTs specifically, have kind of encouraged that with, artists from traditional medium venturing into this space. And also, I think we've witnessed it at Artblocks too, developers that have, ventured into the space and needing that creative mind too, to help guide them as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah. For me, it was a great experience. So, we got along really well. We have kind of family friend connections already. So, so we already know each other, are cool people. And so it was very easy to work with Cole. He was open to creative input. He was open to, me saying, no, technically that's not working. We have to change things. We got to limit it this way. So it was a lot of good back and forth, I think. I think it was a really good experience. So I do suggest people do that if they can, find people to collaborate with. It really opens your eyes to different aspects that you might not be thinking about. And then apply that back to your own work. So
yeah, I think ours is a little unique compared to other people. I mean, we're friends. It was super fun and easy, and we talk all the time anyways. And for me, Rob's a lifesaver, and is such a master coder and thinker that we could make something together that was really great. I mean, I went pretty far down this road, without him, and then said, Rob, help me, can you help me with this? Like, how do we make it work? What's it missing? And that, I think Rob probably didn't realize that. He's like, oh yeah, I'll help you for a couple of days. And then that ended up being, a few months of us really collaborating on it. And yeah, I've just learned so much. And, I just think it's, friends helping each other, which in the NFT world in general is one of the really nice things. I think artists are really helpful. You notice in a bunch of Artblocks projects, artists thanking, other generative artists that I'm sure help them with different problems along the way. And that's, totally at least in my experience, different than the like physical art world. There's not as much collaborative desire or camaraderie in terms of producing pieces. So I just thought it was great, and just, you know, lucky it all came together this way.
Right. I guess that's true. In the physical world, it's much harder to collaborate, isn't it? Just, you know, logistics and all that.
Yeah, and it's I mean, maybe it's the technical elements, because okay, you know, how do I use this shader? Like, that's a clear question you could ask someone in a generative piece, but I can't imagine asking, you know, oh, how do I get this blue, or how do I
Right.
paint this realistic, how do I paint this apple, or, you know, whatever it may be.
Right.
I don't know if that's part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and you do need to be physically together more too. I guess that's the bigger problem.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's something that the physical art world of people could kind of learn from. And artists get old and curmudgeony and don't want to share ideas and stuff sometimes.
No, I mean, just in this you know, presentation alone, you could really sense the level of rapport that you have with each other, and hopefully there's more to come in the future. Before we sign off, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I don't.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I hope it gives people a, you know, a little better understanding of the project and what's there. And what I found really interesting is it is easy to go back to these pieces again, these mints, and just look in some more detail. And you can always kind of see stuff that's interesting there. So there's definitely depth there, and I think it's worth people checking it out.
Awesome. Just to end with, I want to say thanks to everyone who will be watching in the future, and a very special thanks to Cole and Rob for speaking on their project. Till next time, be great and happy minting.
Thanks.
Thanks.